In the autumn of 1906, in a side gallery of the International Exhibition of Industry and Labour in Turin, an assistant curator was tasked with clearing a small storeroom behind the Urban Acoustics Pavilion. The electric lights hummed faintly. One bulb near the ceiling flickered in a slow, nervous rhythm. On a narrow table lay an oversized map of Turin, mounted on thick card, its legend meticulously scraped away. Red ink dots marked every church bell tower in the city, with handwritten numbers beside them: 128, 256, 512. An official brochure, printed that same year, described the exhibit as a simple study in public timekeeping and harmonious chimes. Yet when the assistant overlaid a translucent blueprint labelled Campaign Rete Harmonica 1873, the dots formed concentric rings, not around the cathedral, but around an empty square now used as a tram depot. History remembers progress, but forgets what it replaced. As the curator rolled the map away, the light flickered once, and the hum in the wires seemed to rise by a barely audible tone. By late May 1873, in a drafting room on the second floor of the Turin Municipal Palace, Clark sorted through plans for a new citywide timekeeping system. Rain tapped lightly on the window panes. The room smelled of damp wool and ink. On the main table lay a clean linen map dated 1872, showing bell towers, factories, and railway lines, with small crosses where new clock faces would be installed. Officially, the project was simple: synchronise church bells with the railway timetable. The report filed to the Ministry of Public Works describes a rational distribution of chimes for punctual civic life. Yet an earlier tracing, discovered in the archives in 1989, bears a different date, 1863, while showing the same bell towers that were supposedly built a decade later. One Clark's marginal note, in tight, nervous handwriting, reads, "We are not drawing streets, we are drawing coverage." A visiting engineer from Lyon wrote in his travel diary, "At noon, the bells here ring with a precision unknown in our city. It is as if they follow an invisible pendulum in the air." His words drift over the ambient noise. Distant chimes, the soft thrum of a nearby telegraph line, the slow creak of the buildings settling. The two maps, 1863 and 1872, do not align in their street details, but their circles of bells coincide exactly. Today, mobile network planners use similar diagrams to show overlapping cells of transmission. In the municipal archive, the earlier map is catalogued as superseded. On film, dust drifts in a shaft of coal grey light as the camera lingers on the inked circles, silent except for the faint echo of a bell striking 12, somewhere outside the frame. It was meant to be progress. The contradiction between dates remains unmentioned in the ledger. On 14th of February 1881, in a snow-muted courtyard of the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg, workers unloaded a massive bronze bell from a horse-drawn cart. Their breath steamed in the air. The metal rang with a dull, resonant thud each time it shifted against the wooden beams. Inside, in a high coal hall, lit by frosted skylights, an exhibition on national ornament and sacred sound had just opened. The official catalogue lists the bell as New Casting 1880 in honour of imperial jubilees, yet a photograph found in a private album dated in faded ink 1869 temporary storage shows the same bell down to a distinctive spiral groove on its inner surface, already dark with age. On the photograph's reverse, a later hand has crossed out temporary and written only grid bell. A young art student noted in a letter, "When it rang, the floor itself seemed to vibrate. We felt it in our boots more than in our ears." The soundtrack carries that line over the low hum of the hall, the shuffle of felt boots on stone, the distant crackle of a coal stove. A plan pinned beside the bell arranges churches and civic towers along the Neva like nodes in a pattern. Distances between them marked in exact intervals: 2.4 km, 4.8 km, 9.6 km. The official explanation symbolic symmetry. Yet a later engineering report from 1902 uses the same distances to describe ideal spacing of induction coils in an early wireless experiment. The exhibition was dismantled in 1882. No record explains what became of the bell. Today, the building houses a design faculty. Students complain that certain rooms carry sound strangely well, whispers at one end, audible like a faint radio at the other. In the archive's index, the bell is filed under religious art. Its dates, like its purpose, do not quite agree. By the humid summer of 1893, on the shore of Lake Michigan, the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago had become a temporary city of plaster and light. In a lesser-known corner of the fair, behind the more famous electric exhibits, stood the International Pavilion of Urban Signalling and Public Clocks. The air smelled of wet lumber and machine oil. Generators thrummed like distant thunder. Official guidebooks mention the pavilion only briefly. A comparative display of bells, gongs, and timekeeping devices. However, a surviving engineer's notebook, dated August 17th, 1893, 3:15 p.m., Pavilion 14, describes something else. Demonstration of harmonic tower array. When struck in correct sequence, measured resonance persists in the iron structure for 47 seconds. Audience notes tingling in fingertips. A photograph taken that day shows 4 slender towers arranged in a square, each crowned not by a clock, but by a small bell, with unusually thick shoulders. On the back of the print, the caption, "Harmonic Towers, Trial Number 3, has been partially erased. Only harmonic remains legible." One visitor later recalled, "We felt a low tone after the chimes had ended, like a pressure in the chest. In the soundtrack, we hear fairground noise fade into a pure, almost inaudible note, while dust motes shimmer in a shaft of afternoon light, cutting through the pavilion's slatted roof." Curiously, the official construction ledger for the towers is dated 1892. Yet a blueprint recently digitized from a private collection bears the legend Preliminary Study, 1879, Tartarian scheme. The term appears nowhere else in the fair's paperwork. Today, only a few rusted foundation bolts remain in an overgrown park where the pavilion once stood. Modern acoustic engineers who reviewed the blueprint note that the tower spacing, in wavelength terms, would suit not human hearing, but much lower frequencies, closer to the Earth's own slow pulses. On a cold morning in January 1897, in the belfry of Saint Martin's Church in Lyon, 2 workers climbed a narrow wooden stair under a roof lined with frost. Their task, according to the parish ledger, was routine. Inspection of the great bell, recast 1890. The air up there was thin and sharp. Their breath hung like smoke. Yet when they reached the platform, there was no bell. Only an empty oak frame, worn smooth where metal should have swung. The official maintenance report for that day nonetheless notes in neat script minor adjustment to clapper. Bell rings satisfactorily at 11 Orlais. A photograph in the Diocesan Archive, dated June 1894, shows the same belfry with a large bronze bell in place, complete with decorative reliefs of radiating lines. On the back, someone later added in pencil, "Removed 1893 for modernization." The 2 dates do not reconcile. One of the workers, interviewed much later, recalled, "We heard it though. When the clock struck 11, the whole tower vibrated. There was nothing to see, but the sound was there, coming from everywhere." The documentary holds on his written statement, while the soundtrack carries a faint, disembodied toll, followed by a low, steady hum. Below, a city map from 1888 marks Saint Martin's as one of 12 primary bells, aligned along 2 axes that cross exactly at the old Silk Market Square. Today that square hosts a tram interchange with overhead lines, humming softly in the winter air. The parish files for 1893-1895 are missing. A note in the archive margin simply states, "Some folders lost during reclassification." No explanation is given for why a bell would ring, on record, after its documented removal. The scene fades out on the empty wooden frame, dust drifting where metal once hung, the resonance lingering just beyond measured sound. on 7th April 1901, in a dim foundry on the outskirts of Vienna, molten bronze poured in slow glowing streams into sand moulds. The heat was oppressive, sweat shone on the workers' arms, and the air carried the metallic tang of hot metal and charcoal. The Foundries order book for that day lists 3 bells for rural parishes, standard profile. Decades later, during a restoration survey in 1978, a conservator examined one of those bells, now hanging in a small village church in Lower Austria. Inside its thick lip, hidden beneath a layer of soot and wax, he found a set of shallow spiral channels, machined with unusual precision, like grooves in a phonograph cylinder, but arranged radially. An old blueprint, discovered folded in the back of the Foundry's 1901 ledger, shows these channels annotated not with measurements, but with numbers like 32 Hz, 64 Hz, 128 Hz. The official pattern book for bells, printed in 1895, makes no mention of such channels, yet a note pinned to the blueprint, in different handwriting and ink, reads, "Client insists on tart, pattern, no documentation." A local legend recorded in a parish chronicle dated circa 1910 recalls, "On certain foggy mornings, when all 3 bells in the valley rang in sequence, windows shook but no sound was heard by the old or the very young." The Foundry's closure record is dated 1898, 3 years before the order book entry. The contradiction sits quietly in the registry, unresolved. Today, that village bell tower hosts both the old bell and a modern electronic chime system. Audio recordings made during tests in 2019 show transient low-frequency vibrations before each tone, anomalies dismissed as equipment noise. The camera lingers on the bell's inner surface, on the faint spiral grooves half filled with dust, while the voiceover observes, sometimes the most complex diagrams are not drawn on paper, but cut directly into metal, where they are least likely to be read. On a stifling evening in July 1903, a railway clerk from Tbilisi, travelling by third-class carriage through the Caucasus, recorded an unusual entry in his notebook. The train had stopped near a hill town just after sunset. The air, he wrote, was heavy, as if a storm had passed, but left no rain. At precisely 9 o'clock, church bells began to ring. First one, then another, from towers spread across the valley. The clerk noted the times by his pocket watch, each bell starting exactly 30 seconds after the previous, the sequence repeating 3 times. The air seemed to vibrate, he added, and the hairs on my arms stood up though there was no wind. Official railway timetables for that line mention only evening delays due to religious observances. A police report from the same date filed in the regional capital complains of unauthorized signalling by bells, confusing to travellers. A local boy, interviewed much later for an ethnographic survey, remembered older villagers saying, "When all the bells sang, compasses spun, and lamps dimmed for a moment." The soundtrack accompanies his words with faint static, as if recorded on worn tape. A map found in an 1890 diocesan circular shows 6 bell towers in the region aligned along a rough arc that, when extended, points directly toward a now-abandoned mountain observatory. The observatory's logbook for 1903 is missing. The surviving pages jump from 1902 to 1905 without explanation. Today, high-voltage lines cross the same valley on steel pylons. Engineers note frequent, unexplained fluctuations in local geomagnetic readings during certain weather conditions, but list them as within tolerances. As the chapter closes, the camera returns to the clerk's notebook, its pages yellowed, his careful handwriting, noting times, intervals, and a final line. It felt like standing inside a machine too large to see. On 3rd of March 1874, in a cramped office of the Polytechnic School in Zurich, a mathematics lecturer named Weissmann sat hunched over graph paper. Outside, late winter snow melted into dirty slush. Inside, a small coal stove clicked and sighed as it cooled. On his desk lay not equations of pure geometry, but columns of distances, 1.2 kilometer and 2.4 kilometer, 4.8 kilometer. His notebook, preserved today in the school's archives, carries the title Über die praktische Anwendung harmonischer Längen in der Stadtplanung, on the practical application of harmonic lengths in city design. In the margins, he lists examples: Turin, Lyon, St. Petersburg, probable. Each city's bell towers are reduced to dots on grids, their separations expressed in wavelengths corresponding to low inaudible frequencies. An official letter from the same year, filed in the municipal records of Zurich, acknowledges his proposal for standardized bell spacing for improved audibility, but dismisses it as theoretical. Curiously, the letter is dated 1870, while referring to a document stamped 1873. Weissmann notes, almost as an aside, if bells are tuned and placed along these lengths, their combined field should form stationary waves over the urban plan. Possible applications not yet publicly discussed. He underlines not yet. A student recalled him decades later. He spoke once of a Tartaric system for cities, but when we asked, he laughed and changed the subject. The interview plays over close-ups of the notebook, the thin paper translucent against the light, revealing layers of ink and corrections. Modern physicists who have examined his tables remark that his wavelengths correspond, in a rough but suggestive way, to resonances later measured in the Earth ionosphere cavity. At the time, such phenomena had no name. Today, the same school's campus Wi-Fi map shows coverage cells unintentionally mirroring Weissmann's hand-drawn circles. No official connection exists. The chapter closes with a reflected light gliding slowly across the inked arcs, like a wave passing over a silent sea of paper. On 19th of September 1882, in the crowded patent office in Berlin, clerks filed away stacks of applications under the buzzing of early electric lamps. The air was warm, dry, and thick with dust, disturbed by constant shuffling of paper. Among hundreds of mechanical designs, one thin bundle stands out in the surviving index. Patent Nummer 15327, Verfahren zur Abstimmung städtischer Glockennetze, method for tuning urban bell networks. The application itself is missing, only its abstract remains, clipped into a register. By arranging resonant bodies, church bells, civic gongs, at calculated distances, and tuning them to related harmonic ratios, it is possible to maintain a continuous field of acoustic pressure for purposes not limited to timekeeping. In the margin, in red pencil, a clerk has written, unclear, possibly spiritualist? A cross-reference leads to an attached technical drawing, a city plan with concentric circles and radial lines, bells marked as small triangles. At the bottom, in faint English, appears a handwritten note. See also Tartarian method, 1871, file withdrawn. No such file is listed in the catalogue. One examiner, in a private letter to a friend dated October 1882, writes, "We receive strange things these days, schemes to turn the whole city into a single instrument. The inventors seldom sign their real names." The letter is initialed only HK. The Patent Registry's closure entry for number 14327 claims application never completed. Yet a later municipal report from 1890, in a different city, mentions implementation of foreign acoustic grid, according to patent Mod 41327. Two dates, two outcomes, no consistent story. Today, the address given for the original patentee hosts a nondescript office building, its rooftop crowded with radio masts and satellite dishes. When mapped, the distances between those antennas echo the old drawing's radial pattern within a few meters. The camera glides over the surviving abstract, its edges yellowed, while an almost inaudible tone rises and falls beneath the rustle of paper. On 11th of October 1888, in a low brick workshop in Nizhny Novgorod, a bell founder named Sergei Petrovich recorded a complaint in his order book. Outside, the first frosts of autumn stiffened puddles into grey mirrors. Inside, the furnace glowed with a steady orange light. His entry, still legible today, reads, "Client insists on impossible tuning, says bell must respond to earth note, not choir pitch." The client is identified only by initials, VT, and a city, Kazan. Petrovich notes that the requested fundamental frequency is too low for bell of requested size, yet in the margin he adds, nevertheless, casting succeeded. When struck, one feels tone under feet. A test report, dated 12x 1887, but inserted after the 1888 entry, describes measuring the bell's decay using water ripples in a trough of iron filings, an odd hybrid of acoustics and magnetics. The dates do not align. The method is not standard for the period. A visiting priest wrote briefly in his diary, "The new chasm bell is unsettling. It seems to toll even when still, like a distant storm that never arrives." Later, analyses of surviving recordings made on wax cylinders around 1905 suggest that the bell's partials cluster around frequencies close to those later associated with global electromagnetic resonances. Specialists caution that the old recording equipment introduced errors. The alignment may be coincidence. Today, the bell, cracked during wartime requisitions but never melted, stands on a concrete plinth near a tram stop. Behind it, high-rise towers bristle with cellular antennas. Local children climb inside to shout. Their voices, captured on smartphone videos, carry a strange, soft echo, as if reflected from deeper within the metal than its thickness allows. The narrator notes gently, Petrovich thought he was casting for the sky. His client may have been tuning for something beneath his feet. On a damp November evening in 1905, in a makeshift laboratory outside Bologna, an amateur wireless experimenter strung copper wires between two chimneys. Fog clung to the roof tiles. The air smelled of wet stone and ozone from his spark transmitter. His logbook for 8 November records attempted reception at 8:12 p.m. Local interference only. At 8:12, series of tones heard, 3 chimes, pause, 3 chimes. No transmitter known in that direction. He sketched what he heard as a sequence of notes. Then, lacking better terms, wrote beside them. Like distant church bells, but too regular. On the next page, he drew a rough map of his city, marking the orientation of his antenna and annotating. Signal strongest when aerial aligned toward hill churches. Official correspondence from the period, preserved in the archives of the National Telegraph Service, dismisses such reports. Spurious induction from tram lines and local bells. Yet a timetable comparison shows no trams running at that hour, and parish records list no services or bell ringing that evening. In a letter never sent, found folded inside the logbook, he speculated. Perhaps the bells themselves are part of a larger apparatus, ringing not for us but with us, using the same air and wires. A later researcher, overlaying his hand-drawn map with an 1880 plan of the city's bell towers, found that the strongest reception directions matched lines connecting 3 major churches, each separated by distances close to those in Weissmann's harmonic tables. Today, roof antennas on the same street relay digital signals along paths not so different from his hand-drawn lines. In audio from a recent recording session there, a faint 3-tone pattern appears just above the noise floor, dismissed by technicians as mains hum artifacts. Between 1914 and 1917, under the pressure of war, European cities melted their bells. In a grey municipal office in Brussels on 2nd August 1915, officials compiled a list titled "Metals to be requisitioned for the national effort." Rain streaked the window. The room smelled of damp paper and tobacco. The list is pragmatic. Statues, railings, small bells. Yet a separate, confidential annex, declassified only in the 1990s, prioritizes specific large bells and towers, marked on a map with black circles. The pattern they form recurs, radial lines and rings, intersecting in ways familiar from earlier, unofficial diagrams. An internal memo, unsigned, but dated September 1915, reads, "Orderly decommissioning of legacy acoustic network to prevent enemy exploitation. Public explanation, need for cannon metal." The phrase legacy acoustic network appears nowhere else in the archives. The memo references a T-grid but the decoding key is missing. A church caretaker, writing in his private journal as workers lowered the great bell, noted, "When the clapper struck for the last time, the floor vibrated more than ever, like a machine spinning down. The men were quiet. Even the foreman looked uneasy." The requisition receipts bear another oddity. Some bells, listed as melted in 1916, appear in photographs dated 1920, hanging in place. Conversely, bells still present in parish records vanish without mention, dates contradict, metal disappears along map lines. Today, some of the emptied towers host radio relay equipment and air raid sirens installed in later decades. The stone remembers vibrations. Microphones placed inside record a low, constant rumble even on windless days. Engineers attribute it to distant traffic and underground trains. The voiceover remains calm. War needed metal, but not all metal was equal. Some bells were taken for their bronze, others, perhaps, for the invisible lines they stitched through the air. On 23rd May 1937, in a planning office in a Soviet industrial city on the Volga, draftsmen bent over new blueprints labelled "Replacement of Church Bells with Central Loudspeaker System." Electric fans pushed warm air and cigarette smoke in slow currents. The sound of distant factory whistles drifted through open windows. Officially, the project was ideological and technological, a move from superstition to modern communication. A thick binder of plans shows loudspeakers mounted on rooftops, public squares wired for announcements, church towers stripped of bells. On one blueprint, a thin red pencil line has been drawn, connecting several towers and new speaker masts in a sweeping arc. In the margin, someone has written, "Old lines remain," a surveyor's report from the previous year, dated 1936, but bound after documents from 1938, describes unusual echo patterns in certain streets, where loudspeaker tests produced pockets of intensified sound at regular intervals of 80-90 meters. The spacing matches, roughly, the wavelength of a low acoustic frequency, far below the speaker's range. An elderly woman interviewed in the 1960s about life before the war remembered, "When they took the bells, it became quieter, but also not. The air felt emptier, yet when the sirens later sounded from the same towers, it was as if the old bells were shouting through them." The parish records corresponding to those towers had long since been sealed or destroyed. Yet a single torn page from a pre-revolutionary inventory, dated 1902, lists the same structures as primary harmonics, in what appears to be an internal classification. Today, many of those towers are gone, replaced by apartment blocks or office buildings. Some remaining spires host mobile phone antennas disguised as crosses or decorative finials. Radio frequency surveys of the district reveal zones of constructive interference, hotspots where signals overlap more strongly than modelling predicts. The narrator observes, almost gently. The voices changed, from bells to loudspeakers to encoded bursts of data, but the vertical stones remained, holding their original positions like notes still written on a staff. In the present day, in a quiet reading room of a city archive, Turin, but it could be Lyon or Kazan or Chicago, a researcher scrolls through digitized maps on a cold, flickering monitor. The air is cool and dry. The only sounds are the soft clatter of keys and the distant, low murmur of traffic filtered through thick walls. Overlay by overlay, she aligns 19th century bell tower maps, early 20th century requisition records, and modern cellular network diagrams. The dots change colour and shape, bells, loudspeakers, antennas, but certain intersections remain stubbornly fixed. A bell removed in 1915, a siren installed in 1942, a GSM mast erected in 1998. Each stands within a few meters of a point marked primary node on an anonymous, undated blueprint labelled simply Reta Campanaria, Tart. The blueprint itself contains a small contradiction. Its paper watermark dates it to the 1890s, while the ink formula tests as typical of the 1910s. Someone copied or updated an older design using newer tools. In a corner of the sheet, almost invisible until the light catches it at an angle, a short note is scratched into the surface rather than written. The grid persists, as long as 3 or more harmonics remain active. If audible bells are removed, other resonant bodies will substitute. No signature accompanies the sentence. Audio recordings made outside several of these persistent nodes, now mundane junction boxes or rooftop towers, show a faint repeating pattern when slowed down. 3 pulses. Pause, 3 pulses. Engineers call it equipment cycling. Some listeners describe it as bells ringing underwater. The researcher closes her laptop as the archive lights dim for closing time. Dust drifts through the last slant of evening sun. Somewhere beyond the walls, a modern church bell rings, its tone clear and ordinary. Beneath it, if one listens carefully, a deeper, slower hum continues. Indifferent to calendars and regimes, the voiceover concludes not with an answer, but with a quiet suggestion. Official records describe bells as instruments of time and faith. Archives hint at grids, harmonics, and fields mapped across stone and air. The same points on the map keep speaking, no matter what devices we place upon them. The film reel seems to stutter, the frame holds on a single bell tower, now bristling with antennas, then brightens to white as if overexposed. The hum continues a moment longer, after the image is gone.